Well, good day, my friends. Today we are in Nashville, Tennessee, and we are going to be doing kind of an interesting vlog today. Now, I know many people love Dolly Parton, and so a lot of our hearts broke with her recently when she lost her husband, Carl Dean, a man who we didn't see a whole lot of throughout her life because he decided early on that her public life was going to be her public life and their private life would be their private life. And so he made his living as an asphalt paver and then eventually just retired and ran their farm. Today, we're going to answer that question that we've had for years. Where will Dolly be buried? Will she be buried in her family plot with her parents and everyone else? Or will she be buried somewhere different? I'm going to tell you the story of how Dolly and Carl met and reveal the secret of where they're going to be buried, or where he is buried and where she will be buried. Daze with Jordan the Lion and you all, it begins right now. So her story kind of starts over here. Dolly, when she was young, had a gift, and everyone knew it, even though she was from a big family who was very poor, living out in Sevierville, which was about 200 miles east of here. She had a dream, and when she was 13 years old, she started performing, was performing on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, and even had her own song. She had released a song called Puppy Love, so it had given her a taste of what she wanted for her future. So literally the day after she graduated high school, she was 18 years old, she came here to Nashville and moved into this house. Actually, the second floor up here was an apartment, and at the time her uncle Bill Owens and his wife Christina were renting this place, and they allowed Dolly to move in with them so she could start her career. Boy, what a start it was. She said she always had this dream to play music and she never had a backup plan. She just knew as soon as she turned 18, it was full throttle and she was going to come to Nashville and make her mark. And that very first day, apparently, when she came here, first thing she had to do was some laundry. So she tells a story of going down to the Wishy-Washy laundromat, but I've done some investigation and it sounds like at the time in this area, most of Wishy-Washies were actually car washes. And so upon further investigation, during that time, a lot of people just called the laundromat in general a Wishy-Washy. So we found what would be the closest laundromat to here where she could have very easily walked to. I'm going to take you over to where that location was and tell you about what that big day of doing laundry, how that changed her life. I'm sure the people that live here know it, but man, they should have put a plaque there, shouldn't they? This is where Dolly's dream really took off. So Dolly always mentions that she met Carl the first day at the Wishy-Washy, but like I said, they used to just call all laundromats Wishy-Washy. So found out that it was probably called Doc's Laundromat or Doc's Laundrette, and it was torn down in 1966. They met in 1964, so that's why we can't show it to you, but it's now where this park was. And that day that they met, Dolly apparently was out on the sidewalk out in front of Doc's drinking a Coke, wearing some tight red slacks and a ruffled sleeveless midriff blouse that showed off her navel. And Carl was driving by and saw her. He was in a white Chevy and he waved at her. He was tall and tan and good looking, and so they started talking, and she said it immediately struck her that he was looking in her eyes when he talked to her. And he said when he saw her, he said, the first thing I thought is, I'm gonna marry that girl. Then he said the second thing he thought was, Lord, she's good looking. Got that right, Carl. Carl Dean said the day that he met Dolly was the day that his life began, and that he wouldn't have traded any of it for anything. He enjoyed their entire life together, 50 plus years, 60 years. Pretty amazing love story that started right here. Dolly said what impressed her about Carl was that he genuinely seemed interested in what she was all about and what she was talking about. So her career actually kind of started right after that. She signed with Monument Records, and then her and Carl got engaged, and Carl's mom was really excited and was planning a big wedding for him and everything, because Carl's sister had eloped, and so she didn't get to have that big wedding. But unfortunately, they didn't get to, because Dolly's label was afraid, with all the money they'd invested in her, that her being married so quickly and their investment might ruin her career, and so they had to postpone that big wedding. They actually had to go outside of Nashville and go all the way to Georgia in order to have a wedding ceremony, and it wasn't a big ceremony. Unfortunately, the only people that were able to attend were Dolly's mom and the preacher and his wife. Well, here we are at Woodlawn Cemetery, where many of the greats, Tammy Wynette, George Jones, Marty Robbins, Porter Wagner, they're all buried here. And now so is Carl Dean and in the future Dolly Parton. So in order to visit them, we're going to be going to the mausoleum. This is in one of the bereavement rooms. So to find Dolly and Carl, you look for this statue, and then you turn right, go down here to where the two chairs are and make another right. Here is the grave of, or the crypt of Carl Dean and Dolly Parton. There's Dolly with her childhood cabin, the replicas of Dollywood. Married May 30th, 1966. I believe it was Memorial Day that year. And I would guess that's probably their farm out in Brentwood. I know they had a long time home. Kind of curious as to why they chose here. There's nobody, doesn't look like on the side or below that is family or anything, but their love story was unique. A lot of people didn't even know who Carl was. Kind of interesting to finally see this for me, because I always kind of speculated that she would be buried in Sevierville where her family is. Of course, she's still alive, still making music. She said she's made so much music that they could put out a record every year for 100 years after she dies of new material. So Carl and Dolly courted for 2 years before they ended up being able to get married. And so at the time, Dolly was 20, he was 23, and they ended up going to Ringgold, Georgia, about 150 miles away from Nashville. They just went out of town, they were driving and saw this Baptist church, and went in and asked the man inside if he'd be willing to marry him, and he said he was. So that was the start of a beautiful relationship. Dolly said that her mother made a little white dress and a little bouquet, and they were originally they talked about getting married in a courthouse, but Dolly said she didn't want to do that. She said, if I get married in a courthouse, I'll never feel married. So they found that little Baptist church and went up to the pastor named Don Duvall and said, would you marry us? So they do have pictures of their wedding that I'll show. But Dolly's career basically started taking off, and she was headed for superstardom. And he went to an event with her that he just said afterward it wasn't for him. He basically said, Dolly, I want you to have everything you want in life, and I'm happy for you, but don't you ever ask me to go to another one of them dang things again. So pretty much for the rest of her life, she would go to those events without him. She had friends that she said she would take, and she said, that was fine. Carl never gets jealous because he knows it's just my friend, and he'd rather not be there anyway. So Dolly's career after they got married took off. She became a regular on the Porter Wagner show. And she even wrote Jolene about Carl. She said it was kind of a joke song, but it was true. She said there was some redheaded woman at the post office that kept hitting on Carl. And so Dolly said, even though we used to joke about it a lot, it kind of did ruffle my feathers a little bit. Like, why this, lady's got the hots for my married husband, but she got a great song out of it. Maybe one of her most popular songs ever. Dolly said about Carl, he's always been my biggest fan behind the scenes, but he'd never come dragging around. I'd rather bring somebody else with me, He's never jealous of that either. Kind of a loner, so he doesn't really like being with anybody but me. But when I get home, he's not one to kind of get out there and socialize that much. He loves living on the farm, taking care of property as he has for all these years. And we just have a lot to talk about. She said we both have a very warped sense of humor, and I think that gets us through a lot. She said, just like the Jolene thing, how they had that running joke about Jolene having a crush on him. So Dolly's had superstardom. Carl got to live out the life he wanted. He had the woman of his dreams. He made his living, an honest living, as an asphalt paver. And then, as I said, when he retired, he just took care of the farm and waited for her not to be working. They never had any kids. Dolly couldn't have kids, but she's taken care of her entire family and extended family and all the great things that they've done. But Dolly said, one day she looked at Carl and said, now that we're old and that, we have each other, and this time, aren't you glad we didn't have kids because we don't have anybody to worry about? And he said, yeah. So kind of tells a lot about their relationship that really came down to just a deep love. And Dolly said she did at one point have a kind of a wrestling of her heart where she kind of felt like she was maybe interested in someone else, but she said God got her through it, and she never allowed it to ruin her marriage. Rest in peace, Carl Thomas Dean. Lived a good, long life. Lived into his 80s. Now we know where Dolly will eventually be buried. It's a beautiful, beautiful headstone. I love it. I always kind of wondered what it would look like, even if it's not out there outside in Sevierville with the rest of her family. She's here where all of her fans can pay their respects. And Carl's from Nashville. His family owned businesses and stuff, so it's possible he's buried here because his family ties to Nashville. But I think that is a very fitting headstone for them. Hope you guys enjoyed seeing this vlog, and now knowing where someday we will be paying our respects to the great Dolly Parton, woman who's done it all, seen it all, sang it all, helped everyone, been in movies, TV shows, specials. She's helped children learn to read. She's helped fund countless charities. Thank God these two met, because, she's the one person in country music that doesn't have the bad stories of losing everything, falling apart on drugs and alcohol, having multiple marriages. She was lucky enough to have kind of the perfect relationship. Rest in peace, Carl Dean and Mrs. Dolly Parton Dean in the future. Goodbye, everyone. Good night.